As the century turned, Italy was bucking to keep up with the major European powers. In particular, they did not want to be bested by Austria-Hungary, who had adopted a modern auto-loading handgun, so the Italian army would press to do the same. But national pride may well have sabotaged their efforts. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Italian Pistola Automatica Modello 910. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the infamous Glisenti 1910, perhaps the most over-engineered, underpowered handgun of the war. But we'll get there in a moment. Instead, let's go over to the light box. Slightly longer than 8 inches and weighing in at 1 3/4 pounds, this is a very dense, not exactly tiny handgun. It chambers the 9mm Glisenti cartridge, 7 of them feeding from a detachable box magazine. Now, the name Glisenti is actually a little bit odd because that would turn out to be just the middleman in the arrangement for this gun. Sort of. Let's do a little history review. Born in Valle di Chiesa in 1822, Francesco Glisenti was the son of an iron forger. His family would move to Trentino, then part of the Austrian Empire. But selling to Lombardy meant high tariffs, and so they would begin more local production. Francesco would therefore grow up in Lombard society, becoming involved in Italian unification, and would serve in the wars for independence. Afterwards, he would consolidate his family's business in Brescia and focus on steel and gun making. He would pass away in 1887, leaving the business to his sons. Leading those brothers was Alfredo, who took the reins of the family business and further focused on gun making and modernization of the factories. In 1900, he would rename it all to Della Glisenti. Now, as part of his bid to modernize the facilities, well, he wanted to go ahead and start inventing something new, and his focus would be on an auto-loading handgun. Now, the downside of this is that he did not have any technical prowess of his own, at least not to see through the vision of something brand new over the horizon, implemented in what was then a very dated Italian arms industry. It's not just that you have to invent the thing, you also have to invent it in such a way that you can even produce it locally with the machining available, yada yada yada. Producing in Italy was going to be complicated, so he would need a true design genius. Luckily, he would find one. Abel Bethel Ravelli. Born in Schliosa to Piedmont nobility, Ravelli entered the army as a young adult. Through his service, he would attend and graduate from the engineering school of Torino, and continue through a number of promotions before being assigned to Fabbrica d'Armi dell'Esercito di Brescia in 1898. I don't speak Italian, don't start, guys. Here he would dig deep into firearms design. Perhaps one of the most underappreciated inventors we'll cover in this show, Ravelli was responsible for a wide range of auto-loading designs, 2 of which we hope to cover over the course of this series. Now, unfortunately, I'm not sure the particulars of how these 2 people met, but they did share an interest in an auto-loading pistol design, or rather the will to make one. They didn't necessarily have one right away. And instead, they'd have to look for inspiration abroad, and at that point, well, there was one clear, decisive winner in the auto-loading pistol market to the date. That is a gun we've already covered, the Mauser C96. Just to recap, this semi-automatic short recoil locking pistol used a magazine set in front of the trigger. It was loaded by stripper clips. Locking was achieved by a block set under the bolt and barrel extension, linking both together until it was driven down, unlocking them. Alright, so we have our characters in place. Let's talk about the Italian army. They had adopted the 1889 Bodeo revolver, a gun that I have a special place in my heart for because it is probably the simplest revolver ever issued to any military force in history. That is the refinement of what you would call a revolver, and again, we have a whole episode on that, already been there, done that. Now, the Bodeo would prove so effective in terms of its ease of manufacture and rugged reliability, and certainly with its slow, heavy cartridge, it could knock a man down okay. I mean, it's the Italian 45, right? A little less powerful, but regardless, it's okay. Bit of a piece of metal to lug around, but it's okay. Now, the Army was fine, but the Navy, well, they hadn't quite adopted the Bodeo. Instead, they were looking around for something a little bit more modern, and they would lock onto the C-96 and adopt it in 1899, making it their Modello 1899. This is a slab-sided C-96 for the Italian Navy. Small numbers, yada yada. We're really not getting that much into detail on this gun. Now, the Navy had an autoloader, which made the Army a little bit more curious, especially when you add in the fact that by the time we're getting into the early 1900s towards 1910, you're seeing a lot of countries adopting autoloaders. So like 1900, you see Belgium looking at the FN 1900 itself, although it would take a little bit more to adopt that. And then you see things like the German Luger, and then you see things like, well, the Austro-Hungarians with the M7. And Italy was going to be damned if the Austro-Hungarians are going to have one over on them. Now, I'm about to start listing some of the production steps that led to this pistol here, like I usually do. But I want to make sure I say something especially clear in this episode, because it is very important that we acknowledge the researchers who do the really heavy, nitty-gritty work and really obsess about these designs. There was a lot written about the Glisenti 1910 in the past 100 years. All of it's like the same stuff over and over again, and a lot of it was myth. Thankfully, before getting to this episode, a book came out. This book, right here. If you can't see it clearly, that's okay. It's down in the description. I'm not going to butcher the poor author's names. But if you have any interest in the Glisenti, this is not an expensive book. It's in Italian, but it is full of the nicest photos. And these photos belong to someone else, so I can't just share them with you. And these are probably the only gentlemen to track down and take these photos. So I have some line drawings that's going to help you get through this episode, but if you want more, it's right here, and it's beautiful, and I highly recommend it for your shelf, as I do with any of the books in any of our videos, because by supporting these authors, you help them go on to do more research. Alright, so I'm going to put that aside, and we're going to start actually talking about the direction of this pistol, because it's going to go through a number of now, thankfully traceable, prototypes and revisions, and the first one is going to be extremely crude looking. This undated 7.65 caliber simple blowback pistol is clearly derived from the C96 in general profile and layout. It was discovered with a roll-marked Glisenti Brescia banner. Clearly made by hand and of crude construction, it was likely a proof of concept piece. And it's unclear if its construction involved revelli, as while it definitely blends the C96 into a more standard pistol shape, which we'll see him do later, it has none of his telltale locking action or other improvements. The most notable feature, however, is the takedown screw at the front, very much like our final gun today, and likely borrowed from the easy takedown of the Bodeo 1889. The first known Revelli prototype appears to be chambered for the 7.63 Mauser cartridge, again taken from the C96. It featured a fixed box magazine set in front of the trigger guard, Bodeo revolver-like grip, shrouded hammer and bolt path, and a lever for manipulating that internal hammer that doubled as a takedown screw. It is also notable for avoiding coil springs in favor of V-springs like a revolver. This prototype action locked with a dropping block kinda like the C96, but it was cammed by angled lugs on its side, just like the later Bergmann pistols. This same action will also be seen on the later Lottie pistol, albeit with the Lottie and Bergmann it's over top instead of underneath. Alright, so we've progressed to a modification of the descending C96 lock, and we definitely have some final 1910 features starting to appear, but this is still really far away from what we've got, and very, very close to the C96. Alright, let's just dig back in and see, because it does progress, and it moves so incrementally that it's fascinating to watch. Our next prototype returned to the C96 mold with a straighter grip, external hammer fired action, and a safety on the left side of the frame. The design still used the same general underside locking block as the previous one though, an improvement over the C96. With our third prototype, we'll finally see the lines of the Glisenti emerging. Still laid out like a C96, the grip is very familiar, likely taken from the German Luger. It now sports a detachable box magazine set in front of the trigger. The breech block, however, has almost completely settled into the final form, swapping from a hammer fire to a striker and sporting the cross-key bolt stop. The action was also changed and simplified. Instead of the dropping block, it is now a rotating tab. This makes for a much simpler and more compact assembly, and would be retained for our final gun today. I believe you are all starting to see why this gun is going to have so many claims against it for patent violation. Not in the courts, but just in the court of history. Everybody's always saying that the Glisenti was a ripoff of this design or that design or whatever, and the interesting thing is, I rarely hear people say that it was a ripoff of the C96, which is exactly what it's a ripoff of. I mean, it's descended from the C96, and I shouldn't say ripoff, because this thing is much further from the C96 than, say, the Luger is from the Borchardt. I mean, the Luger is just an evolution of the Borchardt. This is a very weird evolution and hybridization of the C96. It's fascinating, and so you have to give Ravelli more credit than just saying, oh, he swapped whatever, stole whatever. Although you will see constantly references to two specific pistols. People will always say that either this ripped off the early Nambu or the early Nambu ripped off this. That's a gun we're going to talk about another time. And there's also something called the Hostler Roche that I have drawings of that you can see now. Still similar, and of course it's going to be similar because everybody's playing with this sort of underside locking block coming from the C96, but they're all doing different interpretations of it. I think it's fairly safe to say that ultimately this is an original idea as much as anything else is. And so, especially with that rotating lock, Ravelli's onto something. This is his baby. And as a matter of fact, we are hopefully going to get our hands on one of his machine guns later, and we're going to see that same style of locking action. We're going to get to talk about it even more. So, try not to be jaded by the comments you might have seen in much older publications in which they say that this gun really had no original ideas whatsoever. I find it to be very original. Good, that's another issue entirely. So let's get back into the prototypes. This next one should seem very familiar. Notably, our grip safety would appear in this series of experiments, and this is likely when the Italian military took notice, sometime around 1905. It chambered the 7.65 Parabellum cartridge, which reveals the now obvious Luger influence. Now, this particular model began to see real military testing at the infantry school in Parma, and they would notice a few problems. Notably, the tendency for the takedown screw to work loose, and the side plate was apparently a bit of a weakness. The gun competed primarily with two other designs. The first was a Colt, likely the 1902 military pattern. While certainly a worthwhile design, it probably wasn't Italian enough. Another gun would be forwarded by Colonel Vitali, a man we'll hear more about later. This was a creative pistol and didn't do so well for painfully obvious reasons, even with my terrible line drawing. Interestingly, Ian has managed a video on one example of this pistol family some time ago, so I recommend you go watch it. There are also notes about another native design known as the Versace. I can't find a single drawing or much of a statement as to what it even entailed, so I imagine it wasn't all that stupendous. Well, when your competition is forgettable, or foreign, or it looks like a twisted elephant, and I don't even know how a human hand can hold that thing, I think you win. I don't know if I'd call that a stellar victory, but it's a victory nonetheless. And so, the Italian government would go ahead and approve the adoption of what was then the model 1905 Glisenti, although they had some notes, and it was subject to final tweaking. Now, we've said this before, but a lot of inventors like to file their patents right when they might be in trouble or need to produce, rather. So that patent didn't get filed until they were already accepted by the government. That gives them the longest lifespan on it. They had high hopes for this action. The government liked the automatic safety, but they also wanted a manual one in addition. Also, for God's sake, keep that screw torque down. It keeps coming loose and the action keeps opening up. This resulted in what's known as the Model 1905/06, which sported a left side safety and still chambered 7.65mm Parabellum. It was expected that this would become the final service pistol design for the Italians, and over 150 examples were made for further testing and trials. And to be fair, it seems pretty solid at this point. Alright, so let's gather ourselves. We've radically departed away from the C96. We've merged it with the incredible Luger. And we have something kind of like this, although firing a milder cartridge, smaller bore cartridge, and generally a tiny bit handier than this. Fairly complicated in terms of manufacture, but no more so than most other automatics of that era. I mean, guys, we referenced the Luger, and it was a very good pistol, but you have to argue that the Luger is definitely as complicated as a Glisenti in many ways. So, 1905, 1906, 1907, this is a better than average auto-loading handgun, and it's coming out of Italy. We're doing great. We're doing really, really, really good. And that's how I like to think things were for Alfredo when he unexpectedly died in March of 1907. I like to think that he left on a high note, because it gets a little weirder from here on out. Now, with his passing, his family would inherit the businesses, and they decided to sort of break out the gun manufacturer aspect of it, especially the handgun manufacturer. Nobody else had the sort of will to, ride that horse all the way through. So they would sell it to another company, along with the patents and all the development. Basically, everything that is this handgun is going over to Metallurgica Bresciana Tempini. So that's why our gun today, despite being invented by Ravelli and manufactured by MBT, is still called Glisenti. Okay? Well, that and fraud. You see, Ravelli was actually a special advisor to the committee that was selecting Italy's next handgun. And he kind of hadn't mentioned that he had designed the one that they were looking at, which is totally a legitimate and above-board thing to do. The man is lucky he knew how to design a gun, because this did not result in the end of his career. Anyway, so, fraud aside, the Glisenti is going forward, and it looks like everything's ready to get going. The 150 are doing well. We've got some little changes. Should be fine. And then, well, the Germans. You see, they had adopted the Luger P08, which made Italy realize that the 7.65 Parabellum cartridge wasn't everything that they had wanted. Instead, they lusted after the 9mm Parabellum cartridge now, which we all recognize today, and we've definitely covered its development. A compromise between power and overall length to get just the right grip size and oomph. Well, if the Luger can go from 7.65 Parabellum to 9mm Parabellum just by sort of rechambering it and tweaking a couple little things, then obviously it'll be just as simple for the Glisenti to do this as well. No, these things cracked up as much as I did. But in a bid of complete bureaucracy, they decided that they wanted a 9x19mm cartridge, and so a 9x19mm cartridge they were going to get. They just had to make sure that it was dialed down enough not to break anything. Yep, they would adopt a physically identical cartridge with a lighter load so that the action didn't come apart. That's it, guys. 9mm Glisenti is just a weak 9mm Parabellum. Nothing dangerous about this combination at all. So that little change, plus manual safety on the breech block, always with that. They did it on the Beretta too. Anyway, the change and this one would take what was actually a fairly good pistol for its time and turn it into a mediocre one. And then by 1914 it was terrible. Alright, let's go ahead and take a closer look at what the heck I'm talking about though. So, zooming in, we are going to see a pistol. If you guys have made it this far, congratulations. Now, we have a short recoil locking action semi-automatic pistol feeding from a detachable box magazine. If I flip this around, we're going to see two controls. Actually, I got big fingers. Now I got little finger. All right, so that is going to be a slide lock. Show it to you in a second. This down here is our actual magazine release. Now, it is a positive magazine release, so Mae is at least not going to be entirely disappointed with it being at the heel. The magazine itself, big cutaway, grasping grooves so that you can help pull the follower down to help load the cartridges. Honestly, not a bad design. Unfortunately, in execution, it seems to be a little poor because this thing gets deformed so incredibly easily. We had to adjust it like 3 times in the number of times we shot this gun, also being 3. It just seems like it really wants to walk out. Kind of a weak point for the gun. Now, the gun will lock open on empty, but also with that slide lock button, I'm upside down, right there, guys. I'm going to push that, hard to do in camera, upside down, so I'm just going to pull that back, push that, and I better push it a little harder. There we go. And boom, we're locked back. Now, a lock open, as we've seen before, is a very important feature on semi-automatic handguns, especially these early guys. Very glad to have it there. And while she's back, I want to show you this safety. Now, the idea here is that we're supposed to be able to turn this, and then boom, we can no longer drop our pin. Unfortunately, this thing is threaded, and a lot of people over the years have confused it as being part of the takedown system. And so, they'll just start unscrewing it. And I have yet to find a single Glisenti in which the safety still works, because there's just a simple little nub in there on the collar, and it's just worn off every time. Every single time, because somebody has just sat there and grabbed these 2 tabs, assumed that they were a disassembly device, not a safety device, and just spun them. And it really doesn't do anything for disassembly. And even though it unthreads, you want to move that striker system out of the way, or rather the indicator in this point, you want to move it out of the way before you take it off. And we're not going that far into the disassembly of this gun today anyway. But if you own a Glisenti, don't just twist this off, because you might still maybe have the safety nub. And by the way, if your safety is based off of a millimeter tall nub in there that wears off the minute you unscrew it several times, I wouldn't bet my life on the safety anyway. It seems to be something that they just sort of threw on last minute to appease the military. Now, if I let her back down, you can also see that we have our front grip safety. Very simple mechanism. We'll see more of it in our animation, but no bango, and then if I do that, it'll get bango, but I am not dry firing this guy today. For disassembly, back upside down, at the front of this gun, I have a button underneath that knob. I have to depress the button, and then I'm trying to do this where you guys can even remotely see what I'm doing. Oh, this is not the easiest way to do things. There we go. I'm going to unthread this guy, and then that's going to allow me to just sort of pop this plate, and this whole side plate, by the way, Mark went over this in his video. Look at that beautiful jeweled metal. Now, boom, we're into our action. All right, and if I orient this in a way that makes sense, we're going to see trigger and sear mechanism up at the front. We're going to see our lock back here, and we're missing, in case you know these guns well, a special tool that was left inside the pistol to help with further disassembly. There's essentially a flat screwdriver with a sort of square-headed wrench set up to it. We just sadly don't have one in this pistol, and thankfully we don't really need it to go as deep as we're going to do. Now, the rest of the gun can just be sort of wiggled off the top. It takes a little of compressing of the spring backwards and wiggling. You also want to make sure you don't accidentally send any springs flying while you're doing this part. And then you just sort of open it up like a clam, and we're out. So now we have the upper half, lower half, and again, this is our rotating lock. Has some spring tension to sort of keep it in its 2 phases. Good. Easy. Now, over here, I'm really not going to get too deep into disassembling this. We're going to see a lot of it in the animation, but our special tool would allow us to punch this guy out, and then, as a matter of fact, I can just go ahead and get that far for you guys. We'll just wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. And wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. And then give me just a moment to get a little strength on it, and we're out. So there's our cross key, and I'm sorry I got big mitts, but there's our cross key. It's out. And then if you look, like I said before, now this guy's free to be manipulated out of the way so that we can actually unscrew that without damaging damaging our safety. So everything here, pretty straightforward striker system. If you want to get into the firing pin, this is actually threaded, this little rectangle. It's threaded, and then our special tool would have spun that off. I don't want to go that far into it. It's very fine in there, and I don't really need to be in there right now. But again, if you're doing disassembly, just to warn you guys one more time so that if there's any of these out there that isn't currently damaged, doesn't get damaged, do not just unthread this. You need to get, and you can, there's a way to do it if you look it up. I'm not going to go into that much detail today, but you can get that interior cylinder moved, and then you can unscrew this without dragging the little locking lug across it the entire time. Whoever first started doing these was manhandling them, and then by the time you get one that's damaged, you can just do it. Like I can freehand this one right now because it's already damaged. This one doesn't work, and you can see it's very easy for me to do this. That's not the correct way to do that. And the fact that I can do it so easily means that the lug is already broken off in there or just sort of ground down. All right, so I think I frantically covered as much of this pistol as possible. Just so you know, you can slow down the video speed if you need to and double check back, but it was a lot to remember. And still, there's still more to go. It still has a very unique sear layout, some other unique components, so I say let's put on our X-ray specs and get Bruno's help. Take a look at an animation on this thing. Let's load her up and chamber our first round. Starting off, pay attention to that lock. Once we fire the pistol, the bolt is going to drive rearwards, into it. But the lock is held captive by a rear plate, which is part of the barrel extension. As the gun recoils, we'll see room open up for that lock to rotate. The true locking distance is extremely short, as it begins to rotate almost immediately, allowing the bolt and barrel to separate right away. This has actually led to these being considered delayed blowback pistols by some. But the bolt and barrel are still locked together, just not tightly. It's opening up. So at this point, the case is still containing the gas pressure, and the bolt cannot move completely independently of the barrel until the extension is halted by the rear of the frame, at which point the lock is fully open. Taking a look at the automatic grip safety, we can see it serves as just a simple trigger block. And here is that weak manual safety at the rear, which works a lot like the Japanese Arisaka Type 38 rifle, turning to keep the firing pin from traveling forward. Now let's look at that sear. The Glisenti has a unique arrangement, with it forward of the magazine, which gives it a crisp trigger because it lacks that long transfer bar. But to get the most drop, the action has you cam back the firing pin as you're pulling the trigger, which makes it very heavy because you're resisting that firing pin spring. Otherwise, this should be pretty straightforward, so we'll let the animation finish up on its own. And get this over to Mae for demonstration. I'm not gonna lie, it took a few tries to get those shots all out of this guy for the range. This was not a very reliable handgun. Anyway, production for these guys would actually begin despite the name 1910, or rather 910 in Italian military parlance. Production would start in 1909. Now the initial contract would be for 30,000, although from serial data it looks like roughly 33,000 were produced. Some for commercial purposes, but probably just little extra orders for the military. These were serialized in batches of 2,000, with prefixes from A to R, with production wrapping in late 1911 or early 1912. This means the guns were likely available for the Italo-Turkish War, but sadly I wasn't able to find any detailed opinions on their service history there. As a matter of fact, I can't find a lot written about these guys at all after their introduction. And it seems like Italy really wasn't... It doesn't seem like they were too excited to have a bajillion of these laying around. They had produced 30 to 33,000, and then they kind of left it at that. It seemed like that was enough for their peacetime needs, and they still had tons of Bodeo laying around. And as a matter of fact, they still had Bodeo in production, so this thing never actually completely replaced its predecessor. And to be fair, why would you make something as expensive and complicated as this when you had a very aggressive pistol program compared to other nations where you handed out more handguns than other people really generally did? Again, see our Bodeo episode on that. So it looks like these guns had sort of a lackluster service life, and they probably weren't going to be produced in another batch ever again. As a matter of fact, they probably would have slowly been replaced by something else, except for the fact that war were declared. You know what the problem is, guys? Italy had until May of 1915 before they entered that conflict. Plenty of time to tool up and get to work on more of these little babies if they wanted them. They did not. Instead, they sort of rested on their laurels when it came to these guys and put a lot more effort into the old Bodeo production. And that makes sense because this gun is the exact opposite of their good decisions that they made with the Carcano. That gun was simple, reliable, stronger than you would think, and easily produced by a nation with limited resources. As was, again, and I keep saying this, the previous magnificent Bodeo. This guy, however, is ridiculously complicated for a military at war to produce. And, again, a fairly anemic cartridge that could possibly be confused for captured enemy ammo and cause more problems when placed in the gun. So, probably not your best bet. But that doesn't mean that this thing stopped its evolution right here. As a matter of fact, before the war, it would break out into another pattern. The Italian Navy would simplify it greatly to develop their own Brixia Model 1913, one we hope to cover in detail another day. Basically, though, it's the same action, minus a dozen or so bits and bobs, with only 5,000 produced, making it very rare. Both the Brixia and the Glisenti, again, suffered that problem of not being able to use 9mm parabellum, and like I said, captured enemy ammo or commercial ammo that you bought confusedly, you get a lot of risk of damaging this action. And you have both the First World War and another war to go through, lots of years piling up on these things, and then 9mm gets selected for submachine gun ammo, and submachine gun ammo is hotter, and then even more likely to destroy something like this. There's a reason why, despite making 33,000 or so of these, they're still very uncommon in the market today, and I think that's just attrition to ammo failures. I can almost guarantee you a number of these things were torn up by their inability to handle a very easily chambered and readily available cartridge. It's almost suicidal. Not to the shooter, I'm sure. I doubt it's all that lethal to them, but to the pistol itself, yeah, it's not going to come back from too many of those coming through it. That makes these a little bit collectible today. Another failure point in the Glisenti would be the ebonite grips. These were prone to cracking, and so you'll see substitute grips of checkered wood like ours today. Now, I feel like I'm kind of beaten up on this handgun, and let's be honest, it had a lackluster service history. It would last through World War I and into World War II, and then it would sort of vanish out of Italian inventory. I want to love it. I want to love it so much. It's so wacky. It's so weird. It was very early. It was almost ahead of its time in certain things. Well, I couldn't say ahead of its time. What it was doing is it was playing catch-up very close behind current designs. It recognized the value of this. I mean, okay, how can you not love the idea of taking a C96 and a Luger and just pressing them into one gun? It sounds fantastic. And in the original chambering, without this manual safety, and then maybe simplified a little bit further, please, get some of the springs out of there, it's not a bad gun. And like we saw, it's got the sear up at the front. It's not the worst trigger. There's a lot to like. It's just that they just reached one bit too far and just messed up the design by relying on the unreliable cartridge. And that's the heart of any handgun. So I would really like to see a version of this gun like the 1905-06 and just see if it does that much better. But short of that, we're going to have to judge it as we have it now. And unfortunately, It just didn't make the cut. It wasn't worth producing, and the Italians didn't produce it, so they knew that it wasn't making the cut. Now, if you're curious about what did, we do have 2 episodes. One, of course, about the Bodeo. I've mentioned it several times in this episode. And then 2, there was a gun that was built entirely around not being this. And it would launch an entire empire, Beretta. So, I highly recommend watching those 2 videos. As for Ravelli, well, he got a little bit of a slap on the wrist about his deceitfulness over the adoption of this handgun, but it didn't seem to kill his career because he kept on inventing well past the war. And we'll have a lot more to say about that, assuming we get a hold of his good old machine gun. Now, let's go ahead and turn this over to Mae and see how she feels about this ugly duckling. Alright, we've made room for Mae. We tricked her in here by saying that we had some Italian for her, but this ain't spaghetti. Anyway,
I like spaghetti.
I know. Anyway, this is the Glisenti, which also sounds delicious, but it's not food. And we need to put it into Mae's hands.
Thank you.
And we need to get your opinion on firing the little darling. And as usual, I think you guys got the routine. We talk about the ergonomics. What's it feel like when you first get it in your hand?
So when I'm first handed this gun, and I close my eyes, it just feels like something else, something familiar. The Luger. It just feels, honestly, when you first grip it, like a top-heavy Luger. And it looks like a Luger and a C96 had a baby. An ugly baby at that, but a baby nonetheless. Getting into the details of it, it's got this nice deep swoop here in the back of the grip, so it fits into the crook of my hand well. The grip is actually a good angle as well, that it just kind of really like feels like it falls naturally into the palm of your hand. It's very comfortable. That being said, look at how far down my hand is on this gun. Like, it is just way down here. And talking about that, like all the weight, it feels like this entire gun is just resting on the top of my hand. Like, it feels like there's barely any here, barely in the front. It's all just right here in the center of the back. It's absolutely bizarre feeling, but still comfortable, weirdly enough. I would say that. It does have this high bore axis, which we'll get into in the moment with shooting. The grip release, or magazine release is down here at the heel, which I've never been a fan of heel releases. This one, however, it's very positive. It just pops the magazine right out, which is really nice. I definitely appreciated that. Now, the safety on this guy, it's got 2 of them, which, I mean, don't get me wrong, grip safeties are fine. That one was fine to, work around as far as manipulating on range. And operating the safety in the back, flipping it, it's pretty easy to do. That being said, Othais already explained, this one's been broken ever since we've had it, and I don't know, it just feels like a very awkward and weird safety to have to begin with. While I'm able to easily manipulate, it's like, why is it there of all places? Like, that just feels like a very bizarre placement to me. I'm not super big fan of that one. Now, we do have a bolt hold open right here, so I can bring back the breech, hold the button, which is pretty convenient and fairly modern, I would say. I actually do appreciate that, which is really neat. Now, you saw how much I had to struggle in order to actually pull the block back. It's got such a stiff spring in there that, like, you really have to muscle it back. It's not light, so don't go at that easy, guys. Luckily, they made the block at the back, like, jut out just enough that you're just able to get a good purchase on it to pull her back, and they've added little grooves back here to help with it. Someone like me with tiny hands does have an easy time with it. I thought it was not bad. But someone like Othais or someone with bigger hands, they're going to have a little bit of trouble. So try to make sure you really get a good grip on that when you're pulling it back. But otherwise, ergonomics, like, it's just a very weird, awkward gun in general.
I agree across the board. May I? Oh, thank you.
You may.
And what Mae was saying about the serrations and the sort of cocking wings on this breech block, she says it's great. It's easy for her to get a hold of. For me, especially if I have any sweat on my hand or any other problems going on.
Or any grease even at that.
We lube this thing up with ballastol in order to keep her running on the range. My big problem with it is with my meaty mitts, by the time I've got my thumb and knuckle wrapped over, I'm actually, with my thumb especially, I'm actually touching the other side of the cross key that holds the whole thing together. And there's really not a lot of surface area in there for me. Now for her, she's got small enough hands, she can really get in there behind it.
Yeah, I can literally pinch around that. I fit, like, right there. I fit right in the perfect spot.
So, I guess at the time, and again, this is why Mae does the testing, because they didn't have big meaty hands like mine in general back then. They were much smaller framed people with nimbler fingers. So, it was probably just great. Now, and again, ergonomically wise, it's not, there's actually a lot to love about this gun on the base level. The problems come into just what she said, where everything mass-wise is up here, even with a loaded mag. So, let's go ahead and get your opinion of what really goes on once you start firing this thing.
Sure. All right, so getting into the shooting, first things first, gonna load the mag in. And that was the biggest problem with this guy. This is why we had to go to the range 3 times in order to get a shoot, like an actual, a perfect shoot to go through, because this mag, it was so easy to ding up, to bend, like it just, when we got it, it's just been plagued with so much, I guess, that it just wasn't in the condition it needed to be for it to actually fire. We had so much trouble cycling rounds, it was ridiculous. But after multiple attempts from Jay and Othais to get it, we finally got on the 3rd try, but dang, it shouldn't have been that big of a problem. If I'd been betting my life on this guy, I would have failed miserably with that. Next up, the sights. You know, these sights are, you know, they're tall for their time. They're kind of like revolver sights back then. They're not bad. Today, not the best, but for the time, they weren't bad. They're just a little bit narrow. That's probably my biggest complaint, is they're a little too narrow for me. They kind of steeple up to the top, which I feel like they had they made everything else bigger on this guy. They had the opportunity to make bigger sights. Why not just do that? No? Okay, we're going to stop there. Whatever. Nice try, guys. The trigger, oh my God, that was beautiful. It's a really smooth trigger. It's heavy, don't get me wrong, it is a heavy trigger, but the pull through is so smooth. The break is super clean, like it is fantastic, and that's because the trigger is acting directly on the sear in this guy, which, awesome, love it. It does come with a trade-off though, because with the firing pin just acting like a short line of travel right here, that means they had to add a lot of spring pressure to that. So that's why this breech block is so like heavy to pull back. So nice trigger, heavy pull back on that block. Just a weird kind of trade-off there, but you know what? I think I'll take it for being able to have that nice pull through. I do appreciate that. The recoil. Now, yeah, I'm shooting 9mm Glisenti. It was not a bad round, actually. I did like it. But I feel like this was a little bit snappier than what I was anticipating. Only because, I think solely because of this high bore axis. Like, I really think that was not helping this guy at all. But it was still manageable. It was still like a fun shooter. I still was fairly accurate with it at that distance. So, in terms of shooting, I wish they'd done a better job as far as like making this a little more reliable when it came to like the magazine and like other things, and like the safety too. Come on, really? But I still drilled a decent enough hole with it, so
You know, it's a middling report, but I think we've heard a lot less, and I certainly suspected a lot less from the Glisenti. Now, I tried this gun on range 2 and found it extremely frustrating. We had a number of stovepipes and other issues. We tracked it back mostly to the recoil spring and the magazine. The magazine was reformed. The recoil spring, well, we actually swapped it out for as best the pressure as we could match, and it seems like it did a lot better job after that. But still isn't like a 100% gun, even as we got it to this far. I still know that it's very easy if you limp wrist it at all, if you give it to a casual shooter.
It is pretty finicky. Like, it does like the perfect conditions.
Yeah, you got to run this gun like you know how to run a gun. And then, even then, you're not getting 100%. So, granted, this is a sample size of 1, but that's a little concerning. So that brings us to the final point, which is, would you be tickled pink if you were issued one of those in the Great War?
Tickled pink. No. This one, I'm going to give this one a soft no, interestingly enough, because, like Othais said, it's a very finicky guy. Having to swap out, like, the spring and then messing with the magazine as much as we did, like, it just took so much to get this guy running well. And I mean, there are a lot of pros with it, which is why I'm giving it a soft no, because I actually need to try another one. This is the only one I've ever shot. And I don't know, like, if I had one in better condition, if it would just run like a top. And I need to try that because, seriously, it's got a decent cartridge. I mean, it's like comparable to 380 basically. And I get 7 rounds of it. It feels comfortable in your hand. There's a lot going well for it. And I just feel like it could have done better, but with the faults with this guy, it is just going to get a soft no for now. And if anyone has any good ones to lend us, please give us a holler.
I was actually expecting a hard no, and to be frank, I would have given it a hard no right off the gate, just knowing what I know. But then again, I think I might be a little prejudiced at this point, because what Mae's saying makes sense to me. We've got a hold open, we've got a push button mag release, even though it's a little low. This is a fairly modern pistol for when it was made, and in terms of some of the stuff we've seen from the Great War, look at, like, say, the Frommer Stop, where we have a locking action for a 32 ACP cartridge and no bolt hold open. You're right. Coming after the Stop, this does seem more like a military pistol.
Yeah.
And everybody complains that 9mm Glisenti is not 9mm Parabellum, and I get that, and it was absolutely silly to clone the dimensions of the cartridge. But let's pretend for a second that Glisenti was not a clone physically of Parabellum. If it looked just, like a millimeter shorter or something, that put it in that same category as like 9mm Steyr or some of the other cartridges we've seen. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, ballistically, the 9mm Glisenti starts to look better than a lot of the cartridges we see in World War I, because it's not 8mm ordnance, and it's not 32 ACP, it's not any of these anemic, completely anemic cartridges. It's still a decent military cartridge, it's just not as good as the one that we've all become accustomed to as the standard. Well, lots of stuff in the war wasn't that good. So, yeah. Alright, I guess if I stop, and I think to myself, alright, the gun is a little complicated in terms of they put pins and wheels and other little features all over it. But realistically, you're right. The sear is acting directly on the firing pin. They've simplified that, and by the way, they solved the problem that we see in bullpup designs today that people argue about transfer bars and how to carry that and blah, 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 blah. Like, they have it. They just solved it.
That's why the Luger's trigger is just so mushy, because it's got that transfer bar in there. It's not clean. I mean, this guy was beautiful.
That's true. It's got one thing over the Luger, the trigger. Hey, it's something. And they solved that by dialing up the spring pressure, but okay, you only got to cock it once. So I guess you can man up when it comes time to cock it.
I think it's a decent trade-off.
If it runs, you got to cock it once.
Yeah.
So, I know I'm going into this a lot, but it's sort of like we had a whole episode about how this was just a terrible idea from the start. And now I think Mae's bringing it around for me just a bit. The one thing that you can't get away from in this gun, though, is that high bore axis. That is...
Yeah, that's inescapable.
It's ridiculous. And then also, at some level, we're putting in almost as much machine time as we are on a Luger, and we're not getting the reliability of the Luger. So, I can understand why you would not want to buy more of these if you're a country, but I don't know... If you had one that ran, and I agree, this is not a gun in perfect condition, although I think it's in good enough condition, it should have done better. If it ran better, if it had run better, you're right, soft yes. It did not run better.
It'd have been a fairly soft yes, just because of the potential for errors. But yeah, it has still gotten a soft yes. But it just wasn't there.
Alright, so, not quite making the cut, but better than you'd expect on the Glisenti. Alright, I think that wraps us up, unless you have anything else.
Nah, I'm good.
Okay, well, we'll see you guys next time, and thanks for tuning in.
Bye, everyone.
Alright gang, we're on the cusp of a new t-shirt campaign, so keep your eyes peeled. These funds will go towards 2 planned trips that will hopefully net us a dozen or so World War I machine guns on film for all of you. Also, I want to go ahead and share that we're having a little trouble with copyright. For those of you who follow us on Facebook, I think you know the story. The shorter version of this is that if you guys know of special archives, especially music archives, especially non-English or French language music archives, that would be very helpful, And also images, videos, that sort of thing. If you know some nice big archives that are not necessarily common in the United States, maybe they're smaller, or even local music libraries that you might know of, by all means, reach out to us, because we are always looking for war music recorded before 1923 for different countries. We really like to try to get it as tight down on the gun we're talking about as possible so that you guys get to have a little taste of what was going on then. Alright, thanks as always, especially to our patrons for making this show possible. It's getting a bit trickier every day, but with your help, we're getting there.
Because after every single one, you'd be like, mag drop, or